Thanks for putting up with these videos. I think they're getting a little better each time. I believe my little whiteboard that I'm using over here and the little captions, I think that's got to be a better way to teach than me just talking to you. So I hope that you are now convinced that we don't want to rely on methods 1 through 3 for testing validity. I believe they gave you a good sense of how validity works in a very kind of informal sense. But again, if we were talking about a complicated argument, we don't want to rely on these methods. So here's what you're thinking. Jeff, I wish there was a better method. Even if it involves a lot of background detail, if it pays off to where it gives us a real, clear, absolutely perfect way to test for validity, then we want to go through that trouble. Really? I'm glad to hear it. So, let's imagine that this new language was created in this way. Let's imagine that there are a number of you students who, working together, realize that it is more fun to make fun of Jeff than it is to listen to him. So please know that I found you out. I found out that you have been using a secret language to communicate with one another. I appreciate that you kept your little language quiet so it wouldn't disrupt the class. So here's what would happen. Oh, and let's see, who am I considering? So far I have found, let's see, Veronica in Ireland, Bridget and Aaron, Beers, Mac and Michael, Maria and Lamanda, right? I think you guys are the ones that are doing this. Yes, I'm joking, of course. So, because they couldn't stop themselves from making fun of me, what they decided to do is create a secret language. Now, the language began very simply, right? Let me show you. What they would do is they would reserve the top corner of their piece of paper for taking notes, right? They would reserve that top corner for their secret language to make fun of me. So, for instance, right, let's focus on the language, that Bridget and Aaron invented. Bridget and Aaron, here was their language, but all the people had a similar language. This was just so fascinating. Bridget and Aaron would reserve the top corner of their paper, and they would write something like this. And they would slide it to the other one, right? And the other one, they knew what this meant, and so they would laugh. Good? And then the person would respond, right? And they would slide their piece of paper over, and it would have a message written like this. And then Aaron would laugh at this, and Bridget and Aaron would try to stifle their laughter to not interrupt the class. Thank you very much for being so polite. Now, over time, that language got old. I mean, Bridget and Aaron are really immature, but even they could only laugh at the same things for so long. So they developed a more sophisticated language. They began to connect their symbols together to make sense of other things. So here was a fairly sophisticated Jeff put down that they created. And then within a few class sessions, they started creating sentences like this. All right. So now, if we're looking at these, they make no sense to us. But if I tell you what the letters stand for, I think we can start to make sense of this language and build things that would be just like English communication. So now what I found out is when they wrote the letter M, what they were really saying is, Jeff looks just like a monkey. Oh, right? When they wrote the letter L, they were saying, look at Jeff's tiny little pygmy legs. When they would write the letter S, it would say, Jeff is clean shaven. They found that funny because they appreciate basic sarcasm. And so notice when they create their complex sentences. So when they write this sentence, what are they trying to say? Jeff looks like a monkey and he has short little pygmy legs. Wow. And then they got really sophisticated over time and they started writing sentences like this. What do you think this means? It means if Jeff has short little pygmy legs and he doesn't shave, then Jeff really looks like a monkey. And they thought this was great fun. All right. So what we have right there is the basics of our new language. That is, in a simple sense, what we mean by our language called sentential logic. This is a logic of combining sentences together. That's what the idea of sentential means. And so we're looking at the logic of how different sentences group together and how that affects their truth value and their logic. So we are going to learn this language as if this is a language class. So for today, we are going to pretend that you have signed up for a class in the SL language. You could have taken Spanish or French or German, but you decided to take SL. And now, by the way, Anytime you have problems with SL, please know that my stance is going to be that's your problem with English. English is a very imprecise language. It's awful. Its grammar makes little sense. It's incredibly inconsistent, where SL is beautiful and precise. So be ready for that. I am going to be defending SL and making fun of this terrible English language that you think you prefer for now. But you are going to love SL. It's beautiful. All right. So as with any language, right, let's start with the basic components of our language. In SL, the basic sentence letters are represented by all the capital letters of the English language. And let me say something about these sentence letters. These sentence letters represent basic sentences of English. And all you have to do is agree ahead of time, provide a dictionary so people know what your basic sentences are. When you are representing basic sentences, your capital letters need to stand for simple English sentences. That doesn't mean they have to have short words. That doesn't mean that they can't have a good, decent vocabulary. But it means very strictly that they must contain only a single claim and have no conjunctions or disjunctions or negations. When we were doing our structured paraphrase, remember, we had this idea that each line of our structured paraphrase has to be a single claim. Well, this time, yes, that's the basic idea, but now it's even more strict. There cannot be any, this is what a conjunction is, any ands in your sentence. There can't be anything that even hints at a negation. So even if you're not saying the word not, if you're saying something like immature, notice that is still a negation. So you need to make sure your basic sentences of English that these letters are representing are positive and simple. They can only have a single subject, a single verb, and a single predicate. So they cannot even have two predicates like we allowed in the structured paraphrase. The next element of our sentence of SL is the connecting terms. So these are the connectors that allow us to say complicated things from our basic sentences. And so notice, you can say almost any expression in English, you can say it in SL. There will be, a little side note, there will be some expressions that we can't translate into SL. These will be very rare, but this is when, if you're a logician, right? Notice I didn't say magician, don't hear me incorrectly. If you're an advanced thinker in logic, or you're doing advanced programming, you can go to other languages if you need more subtlety. So nerdy tangent, one of these languages, for example, is called predicate logic. We are doing sentential logic, logic based on sentences. Predicate logic breaks down sentences into different, more subtle meanings. Anyway, okay, so that's a tangent. We have only 5 connectives of SL. And this captures all the connectives we use in English. So again, English is really ugly because it has many redundant connecting terms in it. We can capture all the connections that we use in English with just 5 basic concepts. So what I will be doing on my cute little whiteboard is I will be labeling out, right, what the symbol is, what that symbol is called, so we can refer to the symbol, what is the most basic idea of that symbol? In other words, what function does it serve in the language? And of course, these will be very familiar if you're an English nerd. And then I will mention the most common ways that the English is translated. So we will go through the symbol, what the symbol is called, what the technical name for that connection is, and then what are the most common English translations for that symbol. All right. So let's start. First, we have the squiggle, the tilde. You can call it, I prefer to call it a tilde so you don't get it mistaken with some other kind of squiggle. Here is its symbol. Notice, I'm going to be using for my symbols things that I can write on a keyboard, right? So you will find other textbooks using other symbols for these things. They get really weird. I'm going to use what I think is the most obvious signifier when I use them. Negation is a tilde, right? So here is the symbol. It's called a tilde. Its function is negation. How do we see this in English? Well, obviously the English word not, right? But notice there are also plenty of contractions like can't, isn't. And notice also that there are a bunch of hidden ideas of negation. Again, if we say immature. But notice there are also words that have negative connotations that we'll want to assume would require a negation when we translate them. So for example, if you have a basic dictionary sentence that says, someone is awake, well, the negation would be they're asleep. So think of when you're translating an English sentence like being asleep, then we'd want to use negative expressions. The next basic connecting term is this symbol. We call this symbol an ampersand, and it stands for the function of, just as it does in English, conjunction. The most basic English translation here is and. But notice there are also plenty of derivative ways of saying and, like plus, in addition to, also. So you want to think about the English sentences you're looking at and thinking, is this really an and? Good. Next, we have this symbol. This is the only symbol I use that isn't obvious because there isn't an obvious symbol for this. So we will use this symbol. Please don't call it a V because then you'll think we're talking about the basic sentence letter, a capital V. We'll call this a wedge. The meaning in the English function is disjunction. The most obvious translation is or, and there aren't a lot of derivatives of or. There are expressions like nor, but or is a pretty distinct meaning. Next, we will use this symbol. We will simply call it an arrow, really obviously, and this is called a conditional. In other books, you might hear it called a hypothetical. That works fine, but we'll use the concept of conditional. The most basic translation here is if, arrow, then. If this happens, then this happens. But notice there's plenty of derivatives here as well. We could use the word so to mean the same thing. Now notice, we also sometimes reverse the order of this. When we say because, what are we saying? We are saying the same thing as if, then, or so. We're just reversing the order. The easy way to think of when should you use this arrow is any time that there is a clear order in your expression. If you're inferring a causal or temporal order, that's when you use this arrow, because the arrow is our only connective that implies some ordering of concepts. Now you'll notice, when you use an or an and, it is just a list. The order isn't that important to your lists of ands or ors. But when it comes to things like because, so, since, then, we have a clear order in mind. Finally, we have a weird one. Right? This weird one is represented by this symbol, which we'll simply call a double arrow. I am sorry it'll look a little crude on here, right? But double arrow. This idea, the function of the double arrow, is what's called a biconditional. Now think of what that means. That means you have a conditional, but the conditional implies that it can go in both directions at the same time. Now, this one, for some reason, right, you crazy students love the double arrow. Maybe it's fun to draw, I don't know. Here's what I think is actually happening though. I don't think it's just fun to draw. I think that when you're looking at English expressions and you go through your connectives, right, and you're still pretty new to this, and so what do? You're faced with some English expression, it's throwing you off, and so you go through the first 4 connectives that you understand, and you're not convinced they work. So what do? And by the way, I think you do this just to bug the heck out of me. You put a double arrow because I don't know what a double arrow means, so it must be this English expression that I don't understand. Don't. If I was in the classroom, I would pretend to get incredibly angry when you overuse the double arrow. There are only 3 times when you need to use the double arrow. So, when we talk about the other connectives having derivatives we have to look out for, we don't have to look out for derivative uses of the biconditional. There are only 3 instances when we'll need it. So don't put it where it doesn't belong. We will only need the biconditional arrow in 3 instances. When we have the expression if and only if, when we have the abbreviation for if and only if that you only find in nerdy books like I would read, which is IFF period. And the third and only other time you'll use the double arrow is when you have this entire expression. The necessary and sufficient conditions are. Now, so notice, if someone says the sufficient conditions, that's not a double arrow. If someone says if, not a double arrow, that's a single arrow. If someone says only if, not a double arrow, right? That's a single arrow. Only the expressions, if and only if, IFF period as an abbreviation, and the necessary and sufficient conditions are. The last piece of the SL system is simply parentheses. These will function like commas or like basic parentheses in simple addition. So we can group things together so we can see how to solve them. For instance, if I have a basic string of phrases and functions in mathematics, I would use parentheses so I know what order to solve them in. So we'll use parentheses to group meanings together. Now, I am going to convince you that SL is brilliant and you're going to love it as much as I do. So here is my ploy in, what would you say, wooing you to come over to the SL lifestyle. That's so weird. Okay, sorry. The most wonderful thing, wait, I can't say that there are so many wonderful things, but let's say one of the most wonderful things about SL is its grammar. The rules of SL are brilliant. Why are they brilliant? Because they're so simple. How many rules are there for the English grammar system? How many rules of syntax and punctuation are there? Hundreds, right? Probably more than hundreds, because English is dumb, right? You'll realize that you want to leave English behind and go to SL. Here's how it works. How many rules are there of SL? 3. How much syntax is there in SL? Just 2 words. How much syntax is there in English? Tons and tons of syntax. Gerund, run-on sentence, participle, right? You have all sorts of weird language you have to use just to talk about the English language. SL, simple, simple. So let's start with the rules. Now, I am looking at page 16, right, of the syllabus, right, in the middle of the page. It says a word on well-formed formulas. A well-formed formula is just the same thing in English as saying a grammatically correct sentence. So we will use those ideas interchangeably. Something is grammatically correct if it's well-formed and vice versa. So, 3 rules of SL. Rule number 1. A basic sentence letter is a well-formed formula. So, the basic vocabulary of SL, the capital letters from English, each of these is a well-formed formula by itself. So, this is a well-formed formula, this is a well-formed formula, any letter, and of course we would provide a dictionary with, as we said, a positive simple sentence attached to it, so we knew what the English expression is being represented. Rule number 1, set, super easy. Rule number 2, any negated well-formed formula is a well-formed formula. So we can take our basic sentence letters and negate them. Good? Now, so look carefully. If I write this, it is a well-formed formula. The basic letter, right, is a well-formed formula, and I can negate it, and it's still a well-formed formula. So anytime you have a well-formed formula, you can negate it. And you would just simply put the negation, like you would in math. You would put the negation on the left, and that negates everything to the right. So, let's try this. Is this a well-formed formula? Yes. Is this? Now you English Nazis are having a hard time. Why? Because one of English's multiple nonsense rules is that you shouldn't use double negations. Why? We use double negations all the time. Now, of course, a lot of people use them in dumb ways, like, I don't know nothing. No, that makes no sense. But we say plenty of things that are double negations, right? Let's think of this. Wow, look at Jeff. I will be shaving in probably a few days. Oh my gosh, he's not unshaven. Now, was that a fine sentence? Yes. Was it a double negation? Of course it was, right? You said unshaven, which is not shaven, and you said I'm not unshaven. We say that kind of stuff all the time. So, double negations are just fine. So, is this a well-formed formula? Yes. Is this well-formed? Is this? Is this? Is this? Yes, right? Now, I don't really think we'll be needing that. That's going to be hard to make sense of English, but if we wanted to do it, we could. There is no weird fascist rules about numbers of negations. If you need 2 negations or 3, you can use them. See? Beautiful. The third rule of SL grammar to make a sentence well-formed is any 2 well-formed formulas, if combined by a 2-place connective, is a well-formed formula. Now, quick review. If you'll notice, if you look at our 5 connectives, we have one connective, the negation, that only applies the sentence to its right. So when you negate something, it just affects the sentence to its right. But the other 4 connectives, as you can see by their meaning, connect 2 sentences together. So if you're dealing with an and conjunction or disjunction, arrow conditional, double arrow biconditional, right? Notice, I will keep doing that to get you used to the language. I will keep saying, often in synonymous ways, both the word, the symbol, and its function, so you can get used to using these words interchangeably. But so notice, the last 4 of our connectives combine 2 sentences together. So, a sentence is well-formed if it uses a 2-place connective to combine 2 other well-formed formulas. So, this is well-formed. This is well-formed. Now notice, I can take complex sentences, and as long as the grammar is clear, I can combine 2 very complex sentences with a 2-place connective. And so notice, now the hardest part is getting used to the parentheses. How can we capture complex meanings and group things in the way that we intend? That's going to be the trickiest part of this early translating, so don't worry if that part scares you right now. That is the last part that we gain confidence about. And so there is a 4th rule, and what does it say? Any statement is well formed if it is constructed from rules 1 through 3 above. Easy. So technically there's only 3 rules, and that's all there is. So let's get some practice on this. And as we're getting practice, then I'll start introducing what's called the syntax, the language we use to talk about SL. Now, what you will find as you get used to the SL language is that the grammar rules will become very instinctive. For a little while, these seem very strange, but as you use SL for just a little while, because the rules are so easy, that you won't really have to think about them much. In fact, after just a little bit of practice, when you look at a sentence, it'll just look wrong if it doesn't follow our 3 grammar rules. So, this initial practice will seem a little awkward, right? So make sure you can follow it. But even in just going through these examples, I think you'll get comfortable with this really quickly. All right. So what we should do is we should look at what are the, the Q exercises, right? So let's talk about the Q exercises on page 17. So what we will do initially is I'm going to go very slowly through the basic sentences, and we're going to talk about if they are grammatically correct or not. And so we'll need to see if a sentence is well-formed or grammatically correct, or if it's ill-formed and not grammatically correct. Okay, so let's go through it. So here we have sentence number 1 from the first part, the part A of the Q exercises on page 17, right? Make sure you're looking at this. So here is number 1. Now, because we're just beginning at this, right, we should look at it in all of its pieces and see if it all combines together in a rule-based, clear way. So, obviously, the basic sentence letters A, B, C, those by themselves are completely fine. Now look at C. Are we allowed to negate a basic sentence letter like C? Of course we are. So the negative C is fine as well. Now go inside the parentheses. We have the sentence A and the sentence B, and it's combined with the conditional arrow. That is a 2-place connective, so that's fine as well. Now what have we done? We have grouped the arrow sentence inside parentheses, and so we have an and connecting the A arrow B to the negative or not C. Can we do this? Can we use an and to connect 2 sentences together? Yes, we can. That's the rules of SL. So sentence number 1 is well-formed. Sentence number 2. Again, let's start from the pieces and build our way up so we can see all the rules at work. C obviously is well-formed. That's a sentence letter, rule 1. B is well-formed. That's clear. Now look at C. Can we negate C? Of course we can, right? Basic sentence rule, rule 2. Can we negate negative C? Yes. If negative C is well formed, then negative C is well formed. So negative C is fine. B by itself is fine. Can we connect the two together with that wedge, that or, that disjunction? Yes, it's a two-place connective. So sentence 2 is also well formed. Sentence 3. Again, the basic sentence letters A, B, C, those are all well formed, right? Now we have a problem. Look inside the parentheses. Inside the parentheses, it says A negation B, or A not B. Can we connect two sentences together with simply a negation? No. We can't do this in English language either. Unless you're Borat, right? How does Borat talk, right? I am liking apples, not I like bananas, right? No, that we need a connecting term. We need something like a conjunction or a then or a because. In SL, we need a two-place connective. So this sentence 3 is not well formed. Now notice, if there was a two-place connective between the A and the negation, any two-place connective would make this grammatically well formed. Sentence 4. And now, right, we need to say something about another piece of syntax. So let's introduce the idea of scope right here. The scope of a connective is how much of the sentence is covered or is affected by that connective. So let's look back at sentences 1, 2, and 3. When we look at the negation on sentence 1, we could ask how much of the sentence is affected by that negation. And clearly, like the rules of basic mathematics in its use of parentheses, that negation only applies to C there. So if we ask a question, look at sentence 1 some more. If we ask, what is the scope of the arrow? What is the scope of that conditional? And we would look and we would say, okay, the scope of that arrow is the sentence A arrow B, right? That's how much of the sentence is covered by that conditional arrow. But look what happens if we ask about the scope of the and, that ampersand, the conjunction in sentence 1. How much of the sentence is affected by the and? And I think you're already seeing how parentheses work because that parentheses groups that A arrow B sentence. Now what do we see? The scope of the and is the whole sentence. That and includes everything in its meaning. And this means we're now ready for the last piece of syntax when it comes to SL. Main connective. A main connective is the connective that covers the whole sentence. In short, we're looking for the connective, the main connective, that connects together the entire sentence. It affects everything in the sentence. So in sentence 1, look at it. What is the main connective? And. In sentence 2, what is the main connective? Notice, there's no need for parentheses because there aren't multiple two-place connectives. So what's the main connective? The or, the wedge, right? The disjunction. Sentence 3. Notice, even though the sentence isn't grammatically correct, it needs a two-place connective inside the parentheses, we can still tell, however we fix it, that the arrow is the main connective. All right, so now let's look at this. In sentence 4, things get complicated. Let's go step by step and build it up from its parts. Sentence A, B, B, C, those are all well-formed, basic sentences. Let's start inside the parentheses. Can we combine A and B with an and? Sure. Let's look inside the other parentheses. Can we connect B and C using an or disjunction? Yes, of course. And or two-place connectives. So, stay on that right side. Notice what the negation is doing. That negation is outside of those parentheses. So, let's think about its scope. Let's, for fun, underline the scope of that negation in front of B or C. How much of the sentence does it affect? If the negation was directly in front of B, it would just affect B. But notice it's outside of the parentheses. So what does it do? It negates the whole sentence B or C. So its scope is everything contained in that first little parentheses. Little nerdy tangent. Because SL captures both meaning and value, you can't distribute negations, right? So it is not like math. It is better than math. Math can only capture value, but SL captures meaning and value, and so if we distribute, we change the meaning. So negative B or C is well formed. Then look at the arrow. The arrow connects A and B to negative B or C. That is well formed as well. We can take those two complex sentences, combine them with the two-place connective, and the new sentence is still well formed. And then finally, look, there's an outermost parentheses with a negation outside. If you count up those parentheses, or I would literally use my fingers on the paper and see where each one opens and closes, you will see that that parentheses includes all the other content with a negation on its outside. So, can you do this? Can you take a very complicated sentence and negate the whole thing? Of course. And so now, if you're really good at this, what is the main connective of sentence 4? Look carefully. It's the negation in the very front. That negation at the very beginning is the main connective of that sentence. Sentence 5. Now we're ready for the real difficulty. In sentence 5, the basic sentence letters are fine. A, B, C, those are all fine. Good. So let's break it into its little pieces. Let's start inside the parentheses for A or B. A or B, fine sentence. Can we take A or B and negate it? Yes, that's fine, right? We combined A or B, that's a two-place connective, and we can negate that sentence, that's fine. Then notice, then they connect negative A or B to negative C. Is this fine as well? Sure. So far we're doing really well. Now, there is the and. Can we combine, right, two sentences together with and? Can we combine B or C with an arrow? Sure. But something is wrong here. To understand what's wrong, let's look at the scope of each of the connectives. If we look at the or, the scope is really clear. The or covers A or B. The negation in front of it covers what? Negative A or B. But now we have a problem, because look at the arrow at the end of the sentence. What is its scope? It's a little unclear. It is probably B conditional C, but notice, we don't have enough parentheses. So sentence 5 has decent mechanics, but it needs more punctuation. To make this even more obvious, let's ask this question. This is sophisticated. What is the main connective of sentence 5? If you're looking at it, your first guess would probably be and. But notice it's unclear. Here, let me mess with the sentence. Notice, if I put the parentheses here, then yes, and would be the main connective. But look, and look carefully. If the parentheses go here, now what happens? Now the arrow is the main connective. Now the arrow becomes the scope that covers the whole sentence. So there is a problem with sentence 5. It is not well formed. Why? Because it doesn't have enough punctuation. It doesn't have clear parentheses to make its meaning, its scope, and its main connective clear. That is the major function of parentheses. So as you're getting used to them, please note, the first thing we need to do is make sure that the parentheses make the main connective clear, and then they need to make the scope clear as sentences get more complex. So that's what we'll need to work on. So how wonderful is SL? After working for it for just a short amount of time, we can already translate the English language into the SL language. How brilliant is that? You tell me another language that you can really quickly translate complete sentences after just practicing it for a little short time. SL is brilliant, right? Get away from me with your stupid complicated English. SL is my favorite. All right. So what I will be doing is I will be using what's called the translation technique from page 16 of the syllabus, right? So this is what we'll be doing. Now, of course, we aren't dealing with arguments yet. We're just dealing with sentences. So we'll simply skip step 1 first, right? Now, this is important. When we have translation examples on the next quiz, Please note that there will be some basic simple sentences that you'll want to simply translate left to right because SL is a nice clear language, and so you'll say, I don't have to go through the steps on this one. But what I have found is when I am grading, students make just as many little mistakes on the simple sentences as they do on the really complicated sentences. And I think it's primarily because on the simple sentences, you just translate left to right instead of following these steps. So, even when the sentence looks simple, sure, in your head, you can probably translate it just looking at it, but still go through the steps so that you don't make little mistakes. All right, so let's look at the Q exercises, part B. Now, please know that these basic sentence letters and their basic sentences would make sense if we did the diagnostic part. What I try to do, because I'm such a dork, is have concepts come over from the different sections of the class, right? So I'll use examples that refer to things that we did earlier. And so just so you know, my favorite quiz for diagnostics, right? A section that we are not covering. I don't often have time to cover it in a regular semester, right? But it is a case where I think that my redneck friend that I nicknamed Gus, it's not his real name, that I had this notion that my redneck friend, I'm so sorry for this, was molesting my pet tree frog because his girlfriend was in rehab. Now, it wasn't real. It just jumped in my head for a second because my little tree frog had some sores next to its mouth. They looked kind of like herpes. I am so sorry. That is the worst. But please know that this odd topic in these three basic sentences would be familiar to you from a quiz we would take on diagnostics. Good? So it's not out of thin air. All right. So let's work. The first thing we do when we're translating is we look at our English sentence, and the first thing we do is underline any possible connectives. So notice, look back to your basic vocabulary of SL and the 5 basic connectives of SL. So what we are doing is reading the English sentence and looking for any possible connectives that might be there. And it is a good idea to underline too much as opposed to underlining too little. So yes, let's say you underline a word that you think that could be negated, right? That might be a negative idea. Say you say someone's sleepy or short and you're translating that into SL, right? I would underline words like sleepy, I would underline words like short because those might be negative. We'll think about it when we go to translate. So underline anything that might possibly be a possible connective. Anything that might be an or, an if then, right? A negation. So look at sentence 1. Gus has herpes and Speedy does not have herpes. You should be able to see it. You should be able to see the connectives. What do we have? We would underline and we would underline not. Step 2, technically, because this isn't an argument, so we didn't have to start with a conclusion. Step done. We underline all possible connectives. Next, go back and look at your sentence and look for the main connective. In the English sentence, what connective is the most important to the meaning of the whole sentence? Which connective is the hinge for the whole sentence? And in this case, it's pretty obvious. It's and. Now, sometimes in complex sentences, there will be punctuation to help you identify the main connective, and you don't even realize, but that's what you're doing when you use punctuation. Main connective here is and. So, next step. Now, leaving plenty of room for working around it, we begin by translating our main connective. This helps us stay organized and not lose track of the most important connective, the main connective. So, let's start translating sentence 1 into SL. We write, how do we translate and? Obviously, that's our conjunction, that's our ampersand symbol. We start there. Now, we have to keep something very important in mind. Most of our connectives do not change the order of the sentence, but one does. What is the only connective that has an order? Obviously, and even the symbol displays it, the single arrow, the conditional. The conditional is the only connective that might require us to rearrange the sentence to capture the left and right arrow order. We don't want to be flipping our arrow around. We want our SL sentences to be clearly left-right in their cause and time order. But this sentence is an and. An and doesn't affect order at all, so we can leave the sentence just as it is. Its order is fine. So now let's translate the left side. We look for any underlines, any possible connectives. I don't see any. So we simply translate Gus has herpes. Translation, we look at our dictionary. That means G. So we fill in G on the left side of and. Now we go to the right side of our main connective. Speedy does not have herpes. Notice we underline not, so we have to include that negation. What do? Let's see. S means Speedy has herpes. We needed to say Speedy does not have herpes, so negative S. Easy. That's it. We could read that sentence back to ourselves. In SL, it says, Gus has herpes and Speedy does not have herpes. That's the meaning. Now, is the main connective clear when we look at our sentence? Yes. We will get in the habit of writing that in bold to always signify it, but how do we know when we'll need parentheses? If the main connective isn't clear, you're going to need parentheses. When things get more complicated, we want to make sure that the scope of the connectives is clear. In this case, is it clear that the negation applies to S? It's obvious. We don't need any parentheses. This sentence is fine. Main connective fine. Scope is all clear. Done. Sentence 2. Peggy is in drug rehab if Speedy has herpes. We underline any possible connectives. If. I only see if. There's nothing else. So we underline if. Next step, label the main connective. So we'll draw it in bold. What is the main connective? Well, it's the only connective there is, if, right? So if is the only connective, and it's the main connective. So now we can start translating. How do we translate if as a connective into SL, our 5 connectives? If connotes order. It tells you if this happens, then something else happens. So if is our arrow, our conditional arrow, so we'll fill it in. Now, we have a complication. Whenever we're looking at 2-place connectives, we need to check to see if we're dealing with one that requires order, and we are. Arrow is the only connective that can change the order of a sentence, and we're working with an arrow, so we need to be careful here. This is a little tricky. We need to make sure that the sentence is in causal order when we write it in SL. So when we look at our sentence, it says, Peggy is in drug rehab if Speedy has herpes. Well, we need what happens first to be on the left of our arrow and what happens second to be on the right because we want SL to be clear. English is often confusing in its causal order, but SL isn't. So look at it. What happens first? Peggy is in drug rehab if Speedy has herpes. Well, the Speedy has herpes happens first, so we actually need to rearrange this sentence. Now notice, that won't happen all the time. It will happen, say, 40% of the time. Most of the time, arrow sentences are left to right, but sometimes we have an expression like this, an if in the middle of the sentence, or an expression like because. What does that do? If you think about it, it reverses the order of the cause. So, Speedy has herpes goes on the left. Translation, S. What happens next? Peggy's in drug rehab. Translation, P. Now read it back. What does our sentence say? Now notice what happens with the if. The if actually is in front of the left side of the connective, and the arrow should be read as then. Here's what it says. If Speedy has herpes, then Peggy is in drug rehab. What does our sentence in English say? Peggy's in drug rehab if Speedy has herpes. That captures the meaning fully. That's it, right? We have said this even more clearly than the English sentence is. We've captured the English meaning fully. So go to sentence 3. Sentence 3 says, Gus doesn't have herpes if Speedy doesn't have them or Peggy is in rehab. Wow, there's a lot going on there, but this is why we go step by step. We first read looking for any possible negations or connectives. So we read, Gus doesn't, underline doesn't, have herpes if, underline if, Speedy doesn't, underline doesn't, have them or, underline or, Peggy is in rehab. That step is done. We underlined any possible negations or connectives, and we go on. Now we need to find what is the main connective, what is the hinge of the English sentence. I have purposely taken punctuation out of this to make it a little more difficult. On quizzes, they will always be completely fair, but on homework exercises, I will sometimes be a little tricky to point out certain things and to make you wary of them. So we read, Gus doesn't have herpes if Speedy doesn't have them or Peggy's in rehab. What is the main connective? There should be a comma, but there's not. The main connective is at the if. If you'll notice carefully, the or part of the sentence should be grouped together, right? There should be some kind of connection with the or parts of the sentence, separating it from the if part. So the if is our main connective, so we begin translating by filling in the main connective. How do we translate if? That's right, the arrow. Does the arrow affect order? Yes, that's the only connective where we have to worry about order, so we have to look at our English sentence. Now notice, again, most of the time, 60% of the time, the arrow order is going to be fine. I am being a little tricky to point you out to this problem. So what happens first? Speedy doesn't have them or Peggy's in rehab, or Gus doesn't have them. What happens first? We have a similar sentence to 2. Strangely, we have to rearrange this. So on the left of our arrow needs to go to the phrase. Notice we can think of the if as signaling the left side of the arrow. So the left side of our arrow needs to be Speedy doesn't have them or Peggy's in rehab. Let's go step by step. What I like to do is when I see a two-place connective, I like to fill that in so that I can translate around it. So on the left of our arrow, and our arrow represents the if, on the left of, the if then. On the left of our arrow, I'm going to fill in that or. How do we translate or? The disjunction, the little wedge symbol. Now I can simply translate around the or. Does an or affect the order of the sentence? No. An or stays right where it is. We can translate around it. The left side of the or says, notice we've already translated if. That's contained in the arrow coming up. So we translate Speedy doesn't have them. What does that mean? Speedy doesn't have herpes. What do we have? What do we have? Negative S. The right side of the or says Peggy's in rehab. How do we translate? P. Good. Now notice. We have not S or P. That captures Speedy doesn't have herpes or Peggy's in rehab. Good. If you're really good at this, you can see that we're going to need parentheses. We're going to need parentheses because if we look at this sentence already, we can't tell what the main connective is in SL. We made a little note by putting it in bold, but we actually can't tell. So what do we need to do? Put parentheses around the or sentence to isolate it from the main connective, the arrow. Great. So now we go to the right side of our arrow. Gus doesn't have herpes. Translation, don't forget, we underline the doesn't, so we remember the negation, not G, negative G. Good. Is the main connective clear? You always ask that when you finish a translation. Yes, it is. Because we added those parentheses, it makes it obvious that the arrow is the main connective. Perfect. Sentence 4. Read the sentence underlining any possible connective. Now notice, this is going to get a little more subtle. We underline as we read. If, we underline if. Peggy's in rehab, comma. Notice, a comma can often be a connective. So we underline comma. It's connecting those two sentences together, but because English is stupid, it's unclear what it is. We're going to have to read its meaning. Underline the comma. Gus has herpes, comma, and. Underline all of that. Underline the comma, underline and. If, underline if. Speedy has them, comma, underline the comma. So, I would underline so as well, just to be safe. Sometimes so is a connective. I will do this so that I can do that. Do you hear it? Sounds like a connective. So I'll underline so as well. Now, we did a bunch of underlining. The point of doing the steps is that so you don't have to keep a bunch of stuff in your head. Do one thing at a time, label it on the sentence, and then you can free your mind up to focus on one task at a time. So now our next step. Find the main connective. Let's read. This time I put the punctuation in. If Peggy's in rehab, Gus has herpes, and if Speedy has them, so does Gus. Did you hear it? It's pretty obvious. It's the and. There are two if-then sentences connected by an and in the middle. Label the and as the main connective. So we begin translating. The first thing we do, fill in the main connective and make it clear that it's the main connective, so we'll put it in bold. And is the main connective. Now we can start translating the rest of it. We have to ask the key question. Does that main connective affect the order? No, it doesn't. An and can just be left alone, left right where it is. So let's go to the left side. The left side of the and says, if Peggy's in rehab, comma, Gus has herpes. What does the comma stand for? What is it replacing? I think you can hear it. It's replacing a then. That is where our arrow will need to go. The arrow represents the comma, and the comma represents then. So what do we have? An if-then sentence. So let's fill in our arrow on the left of our main connective and. Does an arrow affect order? Yes, it does, right? Remember, arrow is the only one where you might have to rearrange a sentence. So let's look at this part of the sentence. If Peggy's in rehab, then Gus has herpes. The order is fine. We don't have to rearrange this one. We will simply put the arrow in right where that comma would occur in the English. So let's fill in the arrow. Left side, Peggy's in rehab. Notice we already included the if. That arrow says if happens first, then happens second. The arrow contains both concepts. Let's talk about that for a second. Really brief tangent. When I say either Jeff shaved or he looks like a monkey. Sorry, let's go back to what we were talking about before. Either Jeff shaved or he looks like a monkey. Now notice, the either in that sentence is functioning a lot like the if in this sentence. The either isn't a connective. It is just signaling that an or is coming up. The if isn't a connective by itself. It's signaling that a then, where the arrow will be, is coming up. So here in this case, Peggy's in rehab goes on the left, translation P. Gus has herpes goes on the right, translation G. Left side is done. If Peggy's in rehab, then Gus has herpes, clear. Do you see that we're going to need parentheses? Yes, you can see it. There's the main connective, so we need to clearly separate the left side from the and. So we draw parentheses around the arrow sentence. Right side of the and, right side of the main connective. If Speedy has them, so does Gus. Well, let's fill in the two-place connective. What do we have? Now, so does almost sounds like an and, but you can see the meaning here is really another if-then, so we draw in our arrow. Whenever we have an arrow, we have to worry about order. How is the order in this case? If Speedy has them, then so does Gus. The order is fine. We can leave it alone. Left side of our arrow. We've already translated if. It's contained in the arrow. Speedy has them. What does that mean? Speedy has herpes. Simply yes. Right side. So does Gus. What does the so does mean? It means he also has herpes. Translation G. Are we going to need parentheses? Yes. If you look right now, we can't tell what the main connective is. Is it the arrow or is it the and? We know it's the and, so we need to put parentheses around our arrow sentence. Look at it. That is the full meaning. Main connective is clear. Scope is clear. Sentence 5. Speedy does not have herpes if and only if Peggy's in drug rehab. We underline any possible connectives. Speedy does not, underline not, have herpes if and only if. Do you hear it? That is our magical phrase. That is the whole phrase. So we underline the whole thing. That is a single connective. That is the rare sighting of the double arrow, the biconditional. Peggy is in drug rehab. I don't see any connectives. So now we label the main connective. What is it? Obviously the if and only if. So translate. We translate the double arrow, fill that in, leaving room around it for the rest of the sentence. How do we translate if and only if? Yay, double arrow. Does a double arrow affect the order of the sentence? No, it never does. It's like an and or an or. You just put it there, translate around it. Left side of our double arrow, Speedy does not have herpes. simply negation tilde negative S. Left side done. Right side, Peg using drug rehab, simply P. Now look at our sentence. Is the main connective clear, or do we need parentheses? We don't need parentheses. That negation only applies to S. It's clear what its scope is. No parentheses needed. Our sentence is well formed. We've done a perfect translation.